So in early 2021, I took my first trip to the Sunshine State of Florida. Now this wasn't the first time I've been in Florida. I visited Miami and Miami Beach before to do the typical Miami things. But on this trip I would be on the ground exploring the entire state. I went up and down both coasts, all four of the major metro areas, along with many suburbs and small towns. Another interesting thing about this Florida trip is that it was the first time I had spent an extended period of time outside of my home area filming videos for my channel. So a lot of things related to YouTube content were learned here. So in this video, I'm going to share with you 10 things that I, as a traveler with an engineering background, learned while exploring Florida for the first time, so that you can know what to expect when you come down here. Or if you're from Florida, you may get some entertainment out of the perspective of a visitor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you love it, and let's take a trip to the Sunshine State. I've divided Florida into 6 regions. First is South Florida, which is the most popular region in the state. It is based around Miami and also contains the major cities of Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach. With a population of over 6 million people, it is by far the most populated part of the state. Here you will find some of America's most popular beaches, including the well-known Miami Beach. In addition to the spectacular Miami skyline, the entire coast is lined with big hotels, condos, and other types of development. The beaches in this part of the state really don't end. You can drive up Florida A1A and pretty much be on a continuous beach road for like 3 hours. The city of Lake Worth even added the word beach to its official name in order to not be left out of the party. And I can't forget the fitness culture in South Florida. I went out for a stroll in Miami on a Saturday morning and was highly impressed by the large number of people I saw out jogging, walking, or biking, getting some exercise in. Not something you'll find as much in other places. The next area on the list is Disney World, but it's officially called Central Florida. It is centered around the Orlando area and sits near the center of the state. While Orlando itself doesn't have any beaches, it does have an insane number of lakes. Seriously, while driving around this area, it seemed like almost every neighborhood or subdivision had its own lake or two. Orlando does have a downtown, but it is quite sleepy for a city of its size. Instead, the majority of the activity is centered around Disney World, which is to the southwest of the city. Heck, even the Orlando airport is closer to Disney World than it is to downtown. Millions of tourists descend into this area each year to experience the magic and joy of all things Walt Disney. The popular International Drive, or I-Drive strip in the area, also contains tons of attractions and nightlife, leading to some calling it the Las Vegas Strip of the East Coast. I don't know about all that, but it's definitely a cool little strip. Big hotels and the typical development you'd expect from a resort area are all over this place. The beaches for this region come courtesy of a sub-region to the east called the Space Coast, which consists of towns like Cocoa Beach, Melbourne, and Titusville. If you're in Disney World, then you can reach these beaches via the Beachline Expressway for a small fee, or you can trade a lot of your time for money and use State Highway 50 instead. Next is Southwest Florida. This area is centered around places like Fort Myers and Naples. As a traveler, I found this to be one of the least interesting parts of the state. Decent hotels were few and far between, or were extremely expensive. The population trends much older in this area than other parts of the state, so this looks to be one of the areas that many retirees have chosen to call home. The downtowns in this area were pretty quiet for the most part and offered very little in the way of entertainment or food options compared to some other parts of the state. Naples, however, is quite the playground for the wealthy if that's your type of vibe. On a scenery standpoint, there are some beautiful areas on the coast with palm trees, sunshine, and extensive beachfronts. Cape Coral, on paper, is the largest quote-unquote city in the area, and its style of development is absolutely atrocious. But we'll talk more about that later in the video. The next region is Tampa Bay. This area is anchored by Tampa and St. Petersburg, sitting on Florida's west coast. This is a very fast growing part of the state and ranks as the second largest in the state, right behind South Florida. One surprising thing about this area is that despite being the largest city, Tampa does not have the most lively downtown. That honor goes to St. Petersburg. The downtown area had lots of people walking around, out and about, many more interesting restaurants and bars, and just an overall more lively vibe. However, I did happen to be in Tampa when the Bucks beat the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl, and I have to say that the fans came out to represent their squad. One thing you should check out in this area is Bayshore Boulevard. There's a trail alongside it that hugs the bay, and you can get a spectacular view of the Tampa skyline while biking or walking along it. Outside of Tampa and St. Petersburg, you have Clearwater and some of the most popular beaches in the country. St. Pete Beach is referred to by many as America's best beach, and I must admit that the West Coast sunset over there is unrivaled. And lastly, you can take a trip up US 19 alternate and explore the Greek town of Dunedin for some cultural excitement. Then to the east, there is the puzzle that is Lakeland. Lakeland is growing quite a bit in its own right, but there seems to be a debate over whether it's part of the Orlando area, the Tampa area, or its own area. I personally say that it felt like it was more aligned and connected with Tampa than Orlando, but with the explosive growth of these two metros, I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere down the line we don't have a Tampa-Orlando metroplex, similar to Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas, especially once Florida finally upgrades I-4. Up next is South Alabama, also known as the Florida Panhandle. This area contains the state capital of Tallahassee, Pensacola, and the famous white sand beaches of Panama City and Destin. Why do I call this area Southern Alabama? Well, when you come up here, you will feel the difference. In addition to all of the Alabama license plates, the culture in this part of the state is much more stereotypically Southern, and relocated folks from New York and other northeastern states are more rare up here. Panama City serves as Alabama's de facto Gulf Coast beach. This part of the state is much more rural and quiet overall than the rest of the state outside of the beaches, and if I drove around it and told you I was in Alabama, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Then just to the east of South Alabama, we have South Georgia, and Georgia's second largest city of Jacksonville. Now earlier I did say that Southwest Florida was the state's most boring region, but Jacksonville is in a pretty close second. It has a small, quiet downtown and really feels like a generic, sprawling city. Don't let the city population number fool you. This place is easily the tiniest of Florida's 4 major metros. You do have your major big box retailers, plenty of affordable single family homes, and all other things associated with suburbia if that's what you're looking for. The inner neighborhood of San Marco was somewhat interesting, but overall Jacksonville felt like a large collection of disjointed neighborhoods and subdivisions that someone put together and said, hey, let's call ourselves a city. It doesn't feel much like Florida at all aside from the palm trees. And if Georgia redrew the line just a little bit to include it, then I don't think Florida would notice it was missing aside from the tax revenue. The saving grace here is St. Augustine to the south. It is America's oldest city and rich in history as well as interesting things to see. You'll find tons of tourists here year-round. I highly recommend you take a visit. And finally, we have everything else. What is everything else? All those random little towns around Florida that don't necessarily fit into any other region. Those guys that are left out of the bunch. First, there is Ocala. Now, I went to Ocala sort of on a whim while I was staying in Orlando. For reasons unbeknownst to me, it actually ended up being my most popular driving tour video to date. So either Floridians love Ocala, or it's a very popular location for relocation. Or both. Coming into the city on Silver Spring Boulevard, I saw a beautiful palm tree lined downtown area with that famous Florida sunshine on the horizon. It has plenty of shops in its historic downtown, but also some nice homes located nearby. Closer to I-75, you can find the big boxes and chain restaurants that you all have come to know and love. Ocala overall felt quiet, but not too quiet. I can see how it might appeal to those with families or people looking to retire. Overall, it is growing extremely fast, so it might not be too quiet for long. Get in while you can. Slightly north, there is Gainesville, home of the famous University of Florida. This is a college-dominated town, so you already know what to expect here. Lots of bars, lots of walkable areas, at least near the college, and other restaurants that cater to the 20-somethings. Then if you want to take a drive on one of the best highways in America, the Overseas Highway, you can reach Key West at the very southern tip of Florida and the continental United States, only miles from Havana, Cuba. After driving the Overseas Highway, which feels almost like driving over the ocean, you enter Key West, which feels like a Caribbean vacation resort right here in the United States. In Key West, after nearly breaking your neck from admiring all the beauty in the area, you can take a walk down its main strip of Duval Street and have quite the time. And don't forget to visit the southernmost point in the U.S. monument, even though that's technically not the southernmost point, but it's a cool attraction nonetheless. And that's if you can even get close enough to see it, as this area has always seemed packed with tourists. Now that we understand the geography and regions of Florida, the next thing is something that I didn't necessarily learn while traveling to Florida, but something that exploring Florida reinforced more than just about any other place. And that is the fact that city limit populations do not matter when comparing cities. I can't count how many times I've seen on social media and online forums or under YouTube videos where someone boasted or claimed, Jacksonville is bigger than Miami. While technically this is true on paper, Metro Miami sits at well over 6 million people, while Jacksonville at only 1.6 million. putting it more on par with places like Memphis or Virginia's Hampton Roads area. What happened in Jacksonville was that it merged with the surrounding county of Duval to form a consolidated city, giving it a massive land area, one of the largest in the entire United States. So basically the county population as a whole became the city population. You can see this in the real world on the ground, as Jacksonville is a quiet, sleepy town, while Miami is a world-class city full of hustle and bustle and the center of Florida's economy. You can also feel the difference between Jacksonville and the larger metros of Tampa Bay and Orlando. Unless the conversation is about something like city crime, zoning laws, or something along those lines, Jacksonville isn't in the same class of discussion with Miami. And this is why on this channel you'll probably notice that I compare things in terms of metro areas, unless otherwise stated. The next thing I learned about in Florida was Publix. If you're not familiar with the name, Publix is a large American grocery store chain, and it completely dominates the Florida market. I mean, Publix is literally everywhere in the state, seemingly on every corner in the small towns as well as the major cities. When I was staying in Orlando off International Drive, there was a spot in nearby Dr. Phillips area where you could find two Publix stores almost right across the street from one another. While you can still find other grocery stores in Florida like Aldi's, Walmart, and the upscale Whole Foods, no one in the state compares to the sheer dominance of Publix. Why is it so popular? Well, Publix started out right here in Central Florida in the city of Winter Haven. From there, it expanded and simply dominated its home state. Now, Publix wasn't new to me, as they've also made a recent push into North Carolina, but in my experience, I'd say Publix typically has top-notch customer service, clean stores, and of course that famous pub sub. So overall, I guess that the consistency and quality is the primary reason it has been so popular, in addition to being homegrown. If you move to Florida, you most likely will be shopping at a Publix at some point. The next thing you need to understand in Florida is the toll roads. Now, if you're from the Northeast or other parts of the country where tolls are common, then this is not a shock to you. In fact, you'll probably welcome these tolls in Florida for being cheaper than an arm and a leg that you pay in places like New York and New Jersey. But if you're from other parts of the South where tolls are few and far between, the numerous toll roads in Florida will shock you. Being from North Carolina, naturally, I kept the avoid tolls option set on my GPS apps when coming to Florida. I got around just fine in Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Daytona Beach. But once I got to Orlando, things became very different. In Orlando, there is one interstate highway, the infamous I-4. But you'll notice that every other freeway in the area is tolled. If you want to bypass I-4, then there's a loop to the east, Florida 417, that is tolled. If you want to bypass it to the west, there's another loop on that side, Florida 428, which is tolled. If you wanted to avoid the daily gridlock of Colonial Boulevard, then there's an east-west highway, Florida 408, and that is tolled. And for those wanting to head to the beach, that'll be a toll too. It's called Florida 528, the Beachline Expressway. And finally, we can't forget about the Florida Turnpike, which runs diagonally through the area, connecting it with Miami and I-75 towards Ocala and points north. I stayed in Orlando for around 3 weeks, and after about a week of losing so much time to traffic, I finally gave in and bought a SunPass transponder. From where else? Publix. If you're going to spend any significant amount of time in Florida, then I'll recommend that you go ahead and buy one of these. Otherwise, you'll find yourself losing a lot of time sitting in traffic in many parts of the state. Now, the rest of the state doesn't have as many toll roads as Orlando, but in places like Miami, they can save you from a long, stressful drive, or a hefty pay-by-mail bill that can rack up over time compared to just buying the SunPass. If you're flying into Orlando for the resorts, then it might also be in your best interest to get one of the sticker SunPasses for your rental car. Besides, the Sunshine Skyway is awesome, so I'd recommend getting it just for the privilege of driving on that bridge alone. In the Tampa area, one toll road that I did find quite impressive was the Selman Expressway, in particular the elevated portion. This is an east-west highway that connects downtown Tampa to the suburb of Brandon, serving as an alternate route to I-4. The elevated level traveling westbound into downtown provides a spectacular view of the Tampa skyline, one of the more impressive skyline views that you will see from a highway. If I recall, there's an additional fee to use the elevated lanes, so you'll get a pretty comfortable low traffic drive to go along with that view, should you choose to take it. And speaking of roads, that brings us into number 5. I-95. I-95, like in many other states, is also the busiest and most important highway in Florida. Running from downtown Miami through the length of the South Florida region all the way up to Jacksonville with a connection to Orlando and Tampa via I-4. I like to call I-95 Florida's longest raceway. Through most of the state, it is a comfortable 6 lanes and expands once you pass Jupiter heading southbound towards Miami. For the uninitiated, I'd recommend staying in the right lane, as the snowbirds from up north can be in quite the hurry to reach their beach homes. In Miami, you'll find all sorts of insanity on I-95. Destroyed barriers from lane diving into the HOV lanes, speeds over 100 miles per hour, road raging, among other things. But as you approach the end of I-95 near downtown, you are greeted by one of the best urban interstate views on the entire system, with that spectacular Miami skyline. Speaking of Miami, it might have the most insane drivers on the East Coast outside of New York City itself. And another thing in Miami that I learned is that you better have your foot on the gas as soon as a traffic light turns green, or the driver behind you will honk their horn. I mean, as soon as it changes. If the guy behind you sees your brake light still on, then you are going to hear about it. The next thing to understand about Florida is that everyone is moving here. Literally everyone from all over the country, especially the northeastern states. In fact, Florida has knocked New York from its long-held position as America's third most populous state, and now commands a lead of almost 2 million over the Empire State. I traveled to Florida in early 2021 partially because it was one of the few states with the most businesses open during the situation that was going on at the time. Well, I wasn't the only one. Florida has been exploding with growth even before then, but the growth rate has accelerated even further since then. Almost all of its major metro areas consistently rank among the fastest growing in the U.S., especially Tampa and Orlando. I remember when growing up that a city over 100,000 people was something that I had considered as a somewhat sizable city. Well, in Florida, 100,000 is just par for the course. It has 22 cities that cracked that mark, and plenty more poised to reach it in the near future. All this growth has put some strain on the infrastructure as it struggles to keep up. So be prepared to deal with some of those growing pains if you're thinking about moving to the Sunshine State. And this brings us to number 7, which is one of the more unique and somewhat annoying parts of Florida: the bizarre city design. So when I was working in the industry as an engineer, I did a lot of land development, in which we designed the layout and utilities for various neighborhoods, shopping centers, municipal developments, and such. Think of it almost like playing a Sim City or a Skylines video game, but in real life, and obviously much more complicated. Usually you think of a subdivision as a new suburban style development added on the edges of a larger city or existing suburban town. Well, in Florida you have something like that, but for entire large cities. Case points are cities like Deltona, Palm Coast, Spring Hill, Port St. Lucie, Lehigh Acres, among others. These cities have very large populations, but in terms of the actual style of development, you'll find that they almost all look like someone just played a video game and zoned the entire map as single-family residential. Many of you in the comments even questioned where the downtown or center of activity was in these places. Well, there usually isn't one. I mean, these places are just plain weird. Driving around them, you almost get the feeling like they were mass-produced in a factory and just plopped down onto some plot of land in Florida. The roads just curve and wind around with no real direction or pattern. They can end at any point. The city halls might be some random building in the corner of the city limit somewhere. These cities are so irrelevant that despite their population, no one cares about them. Deltona, for example, is the second largest city in the Orlando area behind Orlando itself, and larger than Daytona Beach. But yet no one has ever heard of this town. It's sort of like an overgrown, cheaper suburb to be near Orlando if you can't afford the closer suburbs. Something unique I saw in a place called Port Orange were trailer parks that were laid out like a suburban subdivision, complete with cul-de-sacs and all. I've never seen this in any other state, at least not any that I've been to so far. Then there's Cape Coral. Cape Coral has grown rapidly in recent decades and is still growing fast. It is closing in on 200,000 people and has overtaken Fort Myers as the leading city in that metro area. This might be the most egregious of all Florida cities with this style of development. Outside of the unimpressive commercial district along Cape Coral Parkway, the entire city consists of these style developments, mass-produced and covering a massive land area. When driving through here, I probably wouldn't have been able to tell whether I was driving through a new neighborhood or driving in circles, if not for the GPS. It extends for miles and miles and miles to the north. From an outside perspective, it was probably one of the most depressing looking cities I've ever seen. It's not on the beach, so you don't get any beachfront property, but those lucky enough to have a box on the river do have some nice views of Fort Myers on the other side. Also, they do have these canals that run all throughout the city, and it appears that maybe people can boat their way around town. Credit to them on that, as it does save Cape Coral from being as depressing looking as Port St. Lucie. However, people are moving here in large numbers and seem to enjoy the lifestyle, so who am I to judge? I know this city will probably drive some of our urbanist friends insane. To each his own. Now, for all that I said about Cape Coral, Port St. Lucie, and similar areas, none quite matches up to the disaster that is Lehigh Acres. Lehigh Acres is a massive post-World War II development in the Cape Coral-Fort Myers area. While technically not an actual city, but rather an unincorporated census-designated place, it has a whopping 135,000 people. Lehigh is a failed development from the mid-20th century that never quite became what the original developer envisioned. Instead, it became the armpit of Southwest Florida. I mean, this place is bad, guys. And I've been to a lot of places, and usually I can find something redeeming in most towns, but Lehigh just isn't it. No real commercial districts, poor restaurant selections, terrible road layout, no bodies of water, no gyms, only one library. Even Publix only chose to build just one store here, despite there being 135,000 people. This place is truly depressing. What do people do here to unwind? I didn't even bother filming it when I was in the area. The population is growing quite rapidly as of late, however, which is likely due to the lower cost of housing compared to more desirable parts of Florida. More than anything, don't underestimate where people are willing to move to for the right price of housing. Next, let's talk about one of Florida's best features, the beaches. Florida is lined up for most of its coastline on all sides by some of America's best beaches. In fact, almost every major coastal Florida city has its own beach town nearby. We all know about the most famous one in Miami and the adjacent Miami Beach. That is pretty much legendary. But when exploring around Florida, I noticed the same for almost every other city. Fort Lauderdale has the nearby Fort Lauderdale Beach, West Palm Beach and Palm Beach, Jacksonville and Jacksonville Beach. St. Petersburg has St. Pete Beach, Clearwater and Clearwater Beach. Fort Myers has Fort Myers Beach. Heck, even Pensacola has a Pensacola Beach, which before going to Florida I had never even heard of. It was a hard choice to decide which beaches I liked the best in the state because there were so many good ones, but I'd have to say on the East Coast it was probably Fort Lauderdale Beach. Fort Lauderdale Beach had a good amount of activity going on and was quite lively, but not quite as much as the nearby Miami Beach, which can be a little too lively and rowdy for my taste. The fabulous Los Olas Strip was right across the causeway for a somewhat more mature nightlife option. On the west coast of Florida, I have to go with St. Pete Beach. You've probably seen St. Pete Beach sitting at the top of many lists of America's best beaches, and I have to say that it's probably true. While it's not as busy as the East Coast beaches, St. Pete Beach has some pretty awesome bars right up on the beach sand. This is a place where you can just sit back, relax, and soak in the moment. It's a much more peaceful vibe than Clearwater or the East Coast beaches. I was here for spring break and didn't see too much ruckus. Plus, that Florida West Coast sunset is quite the experience. Highly recommended. And one other beach that I have to mention is Destin. Up in Destin, you have the famous white sand beaches. In fact, they are among the whitest beaches in the world. The sand in Destin gives off that sparkling, crystal-like look when you're walking on it. If you've never been to a white sand beach, then it is a must-see. Number 8 on our list is the absolutely wild number of tourists that are in Florida. One thing you'll notice about Florida when you visit, particularly during the winter months, because why on earth would you visit Florida in the summer, is the fact that there are tourists seemingly everywhere. Florida is by far the warmest place on the East Coast and one of the warmest places year-round in the United States. This makes it particularly popular for people from all up and down the eastern seaboard looking to escape the harsh winters of their home states. The first group of people you'll encounter here are snowbirds. Snowbirds are people from the northeast and midwestern states that experience brutal winters and snow who have secondary or temporary residencies in Florida to live in until things warm back up where they're from. These are usually more affluent Americans, and you can typically find them all over the state, but most prominently in South and Southwestern Florida. They have plenty of disposable income and are a strong source of revenue for the state during this time of the year. The second group are the tourists doing touristy things. These people come down with their families and take in many of Florida's famous tourist activities. You can find them mainly concentrated in and around the Orlando area as they look to explore the Magic Kingdom and places like International Drive. Disney offers plenty to keep your family entertained and your wallet empty when you arrive. The last group of tourists you can find in Florida are the spring breakers. Now, depending on your age and where you are in life, this might be a time of year that you love being out and about in Florida, or one where you prefer to just stay inside. During various weeks of March each year, college students from all over America on their spring breaks descend into the Sunshine State. It's all booze, hormones, loud music, and all sorts of fun and games. I remember growing up in the 90s watching MTV and seeing spring break and dreaming of the day I'd finally get my chance to participate. That day never came. However, there's still time for you if you are a young, aspiring college student. Stay alert though, things can get quite rowdy at times. When I was in Florida, things got so wild in Miami Beach that the city had to institute a curfew. The most popular spots for spring break typically are Panama City Beach, Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale Beach, and Clearwater Beach. So if you're coming down to take part in the festivities, then these are the places you'll want to be. Or if you're looking for some peace and quiet, then you want to avoid them during March. All in all, despite everything that was going on during that time, Florida was able to attract a record 118 million visitors in 2021. Now, this video wouldn't be complete if I didn't talk about one of my favorite subjects, the roads. In 2021, I drove on and filmed almost every major roadway in the state. And overall, I have to say that despite not having a state tax, Florida has some of the most high quality roadways around, with some notable exceptions. We already talked about I-95, but let's look at a few others. The first major road of note is the Florida Turnpike. As the turnpike in its name suggests, it is a toll road. The Florida Turnpike starts at I-75 south of Ocala and travels in the southeastern direction through the Orlando area, then some of the most desolate territory in the state, before finally reaching South Florida and ending at a complicated interchange with I-95 to get you to Miami. Shortly before this interchange, there is an extension that branches off to wrap around the western edge of Miami, functioning as a sort of bypass, and ends in the lovely town of Homestead. On the west coast of Florida, the lifeline is Interstate 75. Coming from Georgia, I-75 doesn't really enter any of Florida's major metros until hitting Tampa. In fact, you'll see Tampa signed as the control city for I-75 as far north as Atlanta. As you approach the Tampa area, I-75 spits out an additional route known as I-275, which is the one that travels through downtown Tampa and St. Petersburg, as well as crossing the Tampa Bay via the famous Sunshine Skyway Bridge. I-75 itself is a rather uneventful route in the area, bypassing the cities, but it does have one of America's first turbine interchanges with I-4. From Tampa down to Naples, I-75 is 6 lanes and functions as the only major highway through that area, after which it takes an east-west turn following the tolled Alligator Alley towards Miami. Speed limits in this area reach 75 miles per hour, the highest in the state, as you cross the Florida Everglades. In the Miami area, I-75 does not quite reach Miami proper, nor does it quite reach I-95, as this route was canceled after freeway revolts in the area. Instead, you can hop on 119th Street, sit in some traffic, and stop at a few lights to get to I-95. Or you can continue south along the Palmetto Expressway. And then there is I-4. You've probably heard about I-4 sitting at the top of many of America's most deadly highway lists. I can personally attest to this. The portion between Orlando and Tampa is you literally risking fate with your life every time you drive it. I mean, I saw one or more crashes on this stretch every time I drove it. It is horribly underbuilt for the population that it serves, and the gridlock is near permanent at I-275 in Tampa and at the Champions Gate area outside of Orlando. The good news is that the I-4 Ultimate project is in progress to bring relief to the Orlando portion. And last, and certainly least, is I-10. In Florida, I-10 travels through the Panhandle and bypasses the beaches in most towns in the area, brushing by the capital of Tallahassee and the forgettable town of Lake City before ending near downtown Jacksonville at I-95. From an overall aesthetic standpoint, Florida ranks among the top in the nation, maybe only behind Texas in terms of its roads. As far as the condition of its highways, Florida was among the best I've ever seen. Major highways were mostly smooth, with very few potholes or broken pavement. If you're coming from the pothole-filled Northeast, then you're going to marvel in awe at Florida's smooth roadways. And the final thing I learned about Florida, which is also one of the big reasons so many people love this place, is that it is simply beautiful. It is called the Sunshine State for a reason. Most of it is warm year-round, lots of greenery, palm trees, bodies of water, beaches, lakes, and such. When driving around Florida, you just feel like you're in a resort at all times. I mean, the whole state just looks like a vacation. There's nothing like waking up in the morning to sunshine and palm trees literally everywhere. Much of the growth in Florida is recent too, so the buildings look clean and modern, unlike some other parts of the country. Even the architecture has that tropical paradise vibe to it. The only other place that I've seen that felt like Florida was Southern California. So there you have it, guys, my thoughts on Florida after spending 3 months there for the first time. Overall, I love my time in the state, and the videos continue to be some of the best performing over on my other channel. Florida is one of those places where there were so many towns that I liked that I had a hard time picking where I would live if I were to move there. I would kind of lean towards Fort Lauderdale or somewhere in Broward due to the proximity to Miami and having a lot going on, but not too much going on. But then again, I actually enjoy the Orlando and Tampa Bay areas too. It's really hard to go wrong in Florida. Let me know what you guys think. What were some of your experiences when you first traveled to Florida? Or if you live in Florida, how are you feeling these days about the state? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you on the next trip, coming soon to a town near you.